Geophysics for?
Carson is a fourth-year PhD candidate working with John Goff and Sean Bullitt. She is currently a fall 2023 UTIG fellow. Woo! Yeah, good clap. She got her undergraduate degree in geology and master's degree in marine sciences, both from UNC Chapel Hill. She is currently working on 2 sand resources projects off the coast of off the Texas coast. One is funded by the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management. Is that like the United States?
It is.
Oh, good. Wow. To look for viable offshore sand resources in the form of sand baits, and the other is funded by the Texas General Land Office, looking for sand resources within state waters, like rivers.
Yeah.
Oh. She uses seismic data to map sediments below the seafloor that could potentially sand targets that would be used for beach nourishment projects along the coast. Everyone, welcome Carson.
Oh. No. How do you, to answer your question, John is fly fishing with his dad and brother. Sean, no clue where he is, considering he's making me do this.
He's in another meeting.
Oh, yeah, awesome. Somebody record this so I can send it to him. Oh, great. And then, I don't know where Chris is. Haven't seen him in a
Chris
while.
is older. Yeah.
He's here, he's just not here. Okay, so in his office. Yeah. Can I get rid of this? How do I get rid of this? Okay. Oh, and that's on your screen, not mine.
Yeah.
I see.
Then you have to blue chain.
It's fine if we can't.
Okay.
Of course. Okay, so this is part of my PhD work. I'm gonna try to not go super over 20 minutes so that I can leave time for toggles. But I actually presented this to discussion hour last year, but at the time I was kind of in the middle of it, didn't really know what was happening, and it is now wrapping up. So hopefully less arm wavy today. So yeah, I'm looking at the internal seismic stratigraphy of sand banks off the Texas coast, looking for sand resources for the General Land Office, and BOEM. Okay, so before we get into that, I think it's always important to tell you, why do we even care about this? So about a quarter of the Texas population lives in the coastal region. So this, really like this map because it really shows how densely populated Houston is and how close to Galveston Bay and the Gulf of Mexico a lot of populations are living. Not only do we have populations growing at the coast, but about 80% of the Texas coast is considered critically eroded, meaning if it isn't supplemented with sand, it'll continue to just erode. And so when you combine these really high erosion rates, so in some places over 14 feet a year, with these really densely populated areas, your coastal populations start becoming increasingly vulnerable to climate change, specifically sea level rise and storms. And so what we were contracted to do was go look for sand resources off of the shelf, because they'll be closer to where they actually want to put them, so more economically viable than trucking sand in from some other state. So I think it's also important to talk about where does sand actually come from in a barrier island system. So this is a map view, and this is kind of a cross section of how it would deposited in the subsurface. So back during the last glacial maximum, when sea level was a lot lower, coastal rivers were incising into the continental shelf, basically creating bowls. That's what this orange line is right here, for sediment to fill up in. As sea level started to rise, these valleys filled in with different kinds of sediments. So at the very top and your very outer portion of your barrier island system, you get a lot of things like overwash inlets, flood tidal and ebb tidal deltas in the barrier island. These are all very sand rich resources that would be very good for sand nourishment projects. I have a question mark there for barriers because they are often not preserved in the geologic record. But if you read my title, it kind of gives it away. We found them. So next is your central bay muds. These are really quiescent environments. So you get a lot of mud deposition, horrible sand resource. If you put mud on the beach, it's terrible. You get mud balls. It's really gross. Moving into the Bayhead Delta, this one's also kind of could be a good sand resource, may also not be a good sand resource. For one, it's going to be deeper in the section so it's going to be more costly to actually extract. But the Bayhead Delta usually has sand interbedded with muds, so it's not quite as clean of a sand. Oh, that's what happens when you bring in multiple things from different slideshows. But the last one is supposed to be river deposits down here and up here. They're also very good sand resources, but they are very deep within your section. Okay, so that kind of leads me to my project, which is we want to try to identify paleo-barrier islands for sand resources. They will have a similar grain size and color as modern day beaches. That's really important. So I'm going to look at two that are offshore of the Texas coast that Boehm and GLO are very interested in. So that's Sabine and Heald Banks. And then also it's really important to understand the processes that are controlling these barrier island preservation. So then we can potentially predict locations of sand resources in other regions, but also understand what shoreline response is to climate change. So this is my study area. We have Bolivar Peninsula right here, Sabine Pass over here. And this is all of the seismic data that's been collected, 4 different surveys, totaling around 1,700 nautical miles of seismic data. We also have 31 core locations from Rodriguez et al. In 2004. However, only 16 of those cores have public stratigraphic information, and of those 16, 10 have radiocarbon dates. This is going to be important for putting this barrier island story in context of time. So these are our 2 banks, these blue blobs. This is Sabine towards the northeast, and then Heald and a little bit of Shepherd Bank to the southwest. Okay, so after we've collected and processed all of our data, then it's important to start mapping horizons and seismic facies around the entire study area. So first thing we do is identify seismic facies. So they vary with amplitude and continuity of reflection. So for example, seismic facies 1 is low to medium amplitude. It's kind of like the brightness of the actual reflector. And then how it's very discontinuous, whereas seismic facies 2, very high amplitude, parallel, subparallel, unidirectional, dipping reflections, some truncations near the base of the facies. And so once we have all of these seismic facies categorized, then we can start bounding either the seismic facies. So for example, H3 is the distinction between seismic facies 1 on top and then seismic facies 2 below, sometimes seismic facies 3. But you can also have horizons that are continuous reflections. So a really good example of that would be H5. It's, kind of tracking this one single reflection. Once we do that, you can subtract them in different ways to get different units. So U1 is going to be at the surface, U4 is going to be at the base of our section. So now I'm going to show you the difference in internal structure of Heald Bank versus Sabine Bank. So Heald Bank's on our left and Sabine is on our right. So these are the different horizons that I have. I'm gonna just quickly tell you what they are if you have questions later, but you're kind of just gonna have to trust me on my interpretation. So in Heald Bank, we have H3, which is this blue horizon. That's our transgressive ravinement. So as the barrier is rolling over the area, it creates an erosional surface. So anything that's going to be above our transgressive ravinement is likely going to be marine. Anything below it is likely barrier. H2 is another erosional surface that really is mostly found in Heald Bank, a little bit in front of Sabine Bank. And we think that's actually just a modern reworking surface. So it's something where waves are able to get down that low in this area and actually rework some of that sediment that's left there. H5 is what I'm calling our base of our estuarine sand unit. So that's our initial barrier island deposit, which is ultimately going to be U3. It's this wedge-shaped structure that's between H5 and H4. And that's really found mostly in Sabine, a little bit underneath Heald Bank. And then finally, the most interesting unit that we have, which is U2, between H4 and H3. So that's what I'm calling overwash. So it is a pretty extensive unit that is only found under Sabine Bank. You have horizons that are dipping, not horizons, reflections that are dipping in a landward direction, and that's consistent across the whole area. Okay. So what does that mean for Heald and Sabine Bank? This ultimately means that Sabine Bank is going to be our paleo-barrier island, but Heald is actually just a marine sand sheet that was never a barrier island. So we're thinking about this in context of sand as well. And so I wanted to make maps of our sand deposits that we have. So this very bottom one is all of the potential sand in the system. You can see that most of it is concentrated on Sabine Bank, with some on Heald and then a little bit of Shepherd. And then we have these different components of that sand unit that have probably different grain sizes and or grain composition. So some could be sands and muds interbedded, and stuff like that. So our U1 is going to be that one that's that homogeneous marine sand sheet that's overlying the transgressive ravinement that we really only see on Heald Bank, tiny bit in front of Sabine Bank. U2 is going to be that overwash unit. Again, you can see that it's really only concentrated to Sabine Bank. Heald Bank is somewhere down here. And then U3 is what we're calling our transparent homogeneous unit above the estuarine fill. And this is likely some kind of barrier or tidal sands that's been reworked as it got deposited. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So one thing that we really wanted to do, and I hope I can convince you even more, that Sabine has this overwash unit, is to actually measure the individual reflections for slope. And so what I did, you can kind of see there's some individual reflections in here. And I actually broke it up into two different sections. So we have a seaward section. They're generally higher dipping reflections, and they're also not as strong as reflections. So if you look, you can kind of see some like white between some of these reflections. Whereas over here, you have much lower angle slopes and much higher reflectivity. And this likely has to do with the composition, the grain composition. So for example, you could have muds interbedded with sands over here, whereas this is probably more muddy, so a more homogeneous component and then a less homogeneous component basically. So once I did all of those individual slope measurements, which you can see down here, so this is to the west, this is to the east, I did it on every other line where this unit existed. I also took some LiDAR data from East Matagorda, which if anybody actually knows what that island is in front of East Matagorda Bay, would love to know, because Google apparently doesn't know, doesn't have a name. And then I also did Bolivar Peninsula. And so these slope range from anywhere from 0.0005 negative to 0.0058. That doesn't really tell you a lot. The average is 0.0016. And so if we put that in context of our slopes that we measured, you can see it's a little bit high. Some of these higher numbers that we're seeing in slopes are really close to inlets. I'm actually considering taking those transects out because inlet dynamics are really complicated and really change the beach a lot. And so it might not be really representative, and this average might actually come down a little bit and be closer to these over slopes. So you can also see that, there's kind of lower slopes towards the west, and then as you get to the east, you start getting higher slopes. And we think that slope might actually be an indicator for proximity to barrier islands. So the higher slopes are going to be more proximal to the barrier. And as you go into the estuary, you're gonna get lower slopes that are be more distal. Okay, so I've talked about, healed Sabine. One's a barrier, one's not. And so now I think the big question is, why does Sabine get preserved? So there's kind of I threw in a fifth one there, ideas of why Sabine got preserved. One thing you might notice is that I'm not telling you why Sabine drowned. I'll tell you in a little bit. But basically, I don't disagree with that interpretation. So yeah, Sabine drowned likely due to the low gradient of the inner shelf. And I'll talk about it in a second. But basically, what people really haven't answered is, why does Sabine get preserved? So there's these 4 ideas, and what I'm gonna do is kind of lump them together and then show you some of my data that I have that either helps or hurts these different ideas of why Sabine gets preserved. The first one is the low gradient of the inner shelf. So basically low gradients produce really high rates of transgression. So this is a modeling study done by Justin Schaller in 2020. And so he has 4 different cases. I'm going to show you 2 that are relevant to this. So this is a low slope case. So slope is 0.04 of the shelf, and then you have the barrier that's transgressing across it. In this case, you have a break-in slope that increases, so you still have that same low slope, and then it starts to increase. And so basically what he found is that when you have these really low slope cases, it actually increases the accommodation or the amount of space behind the barrier. And so sediments actually have to fill all of that in order to maintain their subaerial position. So when you have these higher slopes, you actually decrease that amount of space. And so you don't really have to mess with your sediment supply in order to get the barrier to continue to transgress in these high slope cases. And so ultimately, barriers tend to drown on low slope shorelines. Okay, we also have kind of in that same vein of gradients and topography, a low antecedent topography. So this is the Paleo-Sabine Incised River Valley. So the black is just an outline of basically the whole system. And then I have a much more detailed map of the valley. So you can see that it comes up here, and then you've got some branching off. This is from Lake Calcasieu and some other rivers over in Louisiana. But essentially when you have a low slope topography or a negative slope, so again, I'm showing you a case where you decrease your slope, which would be the case if you have something like a river valley. You increase that accommodation basically so much that your barrier can't survive, it's gonna drown, and then you actually leave this thin wedge-like deposit. Which if you remember, I showed you that initial barrier deposit earlier that I said, just trust me. But it does have that same wedge shape that we're seeing in this modeling study. So this, again, all about topography and stuff. So the parallel shoreline orientation of the Incised Valley. So the Incised Valley actually runs parallel to the modern day shoreline. And so what this is really going to have to do with is how the valley is inundating during sea level rise. So it's going to start kind of, near the end of the valley. So over in the west, and as you increase your sea level rise, you'll start pushing water in here and start getting deposition. Okay, so I just told you about the shore-based gradient, the pre-existing topography, and then the orientation of the valley. And so I totally agree with the whole low gradient part of this. The gradient over near Sabine Pass is going to be much lower than it actually is over on Heald, which is likely why Sabine gets preserved and not Heald Bank, or whatever barrier was near Heald Bank at the time. So this was my attempt to try to define the existing accommodation that is still available for sediments to accumulate in. So basically I made this hypothetical boundary, and it's not perfect because we didn't always map the entire river valley. So I tried to go from the valley edge. If there was a topographic high, then I would go towards that and just basically make a straight line saying, this is the top of our valley. This is as much, anything below it can be filled with sediments. I also did that over here on Sabine Bank. So we're going from this valley edge to this valley edge. And one thing that you might notice is on Heald, it's all filled up with this U4 already. So there's actually not much accommodation for anything to actually fill in. So if you had a barrier in that area, like there's just nothing to help it get preserved because there's no space available. Sabine, however, you start seeing this U3 and a little bit of U2 get preserved underneath that line. However, if you actually look at the accommodation space, it's 7 milliseconds of thickness, which is like basically 3 meters. It's like not very much accommodation for an entire barrier island to fit into. And so basically their accommodation is not really helping preserve our barrier island in this case. It's got to be something else. Okay, so now I will also say with this, I talked about, how inundation occurs. And so Heald is over in this area, Sabine is over here. And so if you have inundation coming from this area, you would have more time to deposit sediments, which is exactly what we see in the seismic, is that the estuarine unit is actually filling up the entire accommodation of the valley and plus some. Okay. So now there's a little reworking of deposits during transgression. So in this, there's different styles of barrier island drowning. So you can have rollover, which is just kind of continuous pushing back of the barrier. You get a really nice ravinement surface, but you basically don't preserve your barrier island at all. Whereas if you have some kind of barrier drowning in place, and I'll show you overstepping in a second, you can actually just increase sea level so much that your barrier drowns and it gets preserved. And then in terms of sediment supply, so this kind of goes into that barrier island drowning and not necessarily rollover. So you can have sediment surplus overstepping and sediment deficit overstepping. And in this case, if you have sediment surplus, you can get partial preservation of your barrier and then also partial reworking, which is maybe what we're seeing with that initial barrier deposit being reworked and then having that really nice preservation of those overwash deposits. But you can also have sediment deficit overstepping. And in this case, you don't really get as much reworking, and you actually get preservation of landward barrier facies, which is pretty consistent with what we're seeing because we're seeing those back barrier overwash sediments getting preserved. So I'm going over, Charles. I'm really sorry.
You're good. You're good.
I told you that I also had some cores, and so I want to kind of integrate the cores first and kind of tell you about timing of things before we start talking about like sediment supply and overstepping and like what happened. So these are from Rodriguez 2004, and so he has occasionally we have some cores that actually don't integrate super well with our seismic, and usually they're fairly far away from our line. So they're not matching up perfectly. But in general, on Heald Bank, we see that there's some intershelf sands on top of some shore face sands, and then below that is estuarine. And so for the most part, this is showing us exactly what we saw in the seismic. We have a bunch of sand overlying that transgressive ravinement. Below it is estuarine. Not super exciting, doesn't really tell us much about Heald system and the barrier that used to be there. On Sabine, however, I told you a few slides ago that we have different reflectivity in different parts of this unit. So over here, highly reflective, probably more homogeneous. Over here, less reflective, more interbedding. And so when we actually put Tony's cores onto the seismic lines in this really high reflectivity phase, he's actually calling it estuarine muds. And then over in this less reflective package, he's calling it shore face sands. And so that kind of indicates to us that this is not a homogeneous sand body. Part of it is probably pretty sandy, but another part of it is also very muddy. So potentially not as great of a sand resource as they originally thought it might be. Okay, yes. So finally, here we are. Tony says that Sabine drowned around 4.7 thousand years ago. However, he does have some dates within that overwash unit that date to around 2.2 to 2.5 thousand years ago. And so while I totally agree that Sabine likely drowned due to the gradient, the timing is very different, just based off of the seismic data in these cores. And so overwash had to be active until 2.2 to 2.5. And so Sabine had to drown either around that date or after it. So basically it was stranded out on the shoreline. It was stranded out on the shelf for a lot longer than people have originally thought. Okay, so this is like my favorite part, but it's gonna be very hand wavy. So we're talking about sediment supply, and one of the big sediment sources to the Texas coast is actually the Mississippi River. I was shocked too when I found out that Mississippi sands can actually get to the Texas coast. That's what I got wrong in my quals. Have learned since then. So initially, the first lobe of the Mississippi, and I'm really, when I say first lobe, I'm really talking about the Holocene, is over way on the west. It's the, I'm not even gonna say it. It's just Mississippi words are hard. I don't know. So anyways, that lobe is supplying riverine sediments to the Texas coast 7,500 years ago to 5,000 years ago before present. And so then right around 550, I forgot I had animations. We start to see the Mississippi lobes shift. And so they're starting to shift east and kind of away from the Texas coast, which is likely going to decrease our sediment supply, specifically sand. And then kind of around the time that Sabine drowns, we actually shift to the farthest east lobe that the Mississippi has in the Holocene, around 4,000 to 2,000 years ago. And so I will point out that yes, we're cutting off riverine supply to the Texas coast, but these abandoned river lobes can actually get reworked for a little while. And so some of that sand is likely still getting supplied to the Texas coast. But once those kind of run out, that's when Sabine drowns and gets preserved. All right, let's put it all together. So this is my conceptual model of how we think Sabine gets preserved. So you have that initial incision of your river valley. It floods during sea level rise and you start getting that estuarine deposition. A barrier may or may not exist somewhere offshore. As time goes by, you start filling that space with estuarine sediment and you fill most of it. At this time, a barrier likely exists and is probably moving closer to the Paleo Valley. And this is kind of the available subaqueous accommodation. So definitely not as much as there used to be. In time 3, you get overwash deposits that are starting to fill your accommodation space. But because there's accommodation space available, there's some back barrier processes like tidal currents that are likely reworking these sediments and leaving you with that just like homogeneous wedge that doesn't really have any kind of internal structure. Finally, in time 4, your overwash deposits continue to deposit as sea level rise. You start getting that inner bedding from just overwash because it's a storm process. It's punctuated and then your estuarine is going to fill on top of it. Another storm comes, your estuarine, so you're starting to get that inner bedding and it's preserved on this like very low slope shelf. And finally, as your barrier transgresses, it leaves behind this preserved overwash deposit and a revenement surface. So this is likely overstepping since we're seeing that back barrier overwash deposit getting preserved. All right, so factors influencing Sabine Bank preservation that I just told you about. So first, low gradient of the inner shelf. Yes, definitely, probably influencing preservation. Low antecedent topography, probably not. We're not really seeing a lot of accommodation that's available, and most of it's filled by like a tiny wedge anyways. The parallel shoreline of the orientation of the incised valley. So this kind of goes along with that antecedent topography. It's actually likely hindering preservation because you get, you have so much time for sea level to rise and deposit sediments in that lower portion. Little reworking of deposits during transgression. Yes, definitely. And then sediment supply with the Mississippi River, also likely influencing the bank's preservation. So that's all I've got. Now it's Charles's turn. No question.
I have a question.
What's your question?
Like, so the main factors here, like low gradient, and I think that's been like pretty apparent throughout this entire talk. I was wondering, if there's like another place in the Texas coast where you would expect to see this like same relationship.
So the Texas coast, so the East Texas coast is the lowest gradient in the state. And as you move towards the south, you start increasing your gradient a lot. So you're likely actually gonna decrease your preservation farther away from the state. But in other states, I don't see why not. You know, Florida has a really broad shelf that you could totally potentially do the same. Although I don't know how many barrier islands they have on their west coast.
Okay, for sure. Okay. I think Patty or something put something in the chat. And then we'll move on.
Are there plans to core healed and or Sabine Bank? Yes. So when we originally went out to collect a lot of this data, we tried to do some cores, and it is very sandy. It is very hard to core. And so we have like little tiny baby cores, but the OEM and GLO are actually putting together like a pretty comprehensive plan to go do vibra coring. So hopefully they can get much longer cores than anything that we currently have.
Hey, Carson. All right, Charles.
I'm not crying, I just put eye drops in for anybody.
Take me.
Curious.
I know they're really emotional.
But that bank drowning really got to me, huh?
Sorry. So sad.
So, HDMI, it's HDMI, no, it's.
Oh, I just
third
shared my
grade,
screen.
Yeah,
Thanks, Charles. Oh my God.
I don't need to turn my camera on, do I?
Oh, you're on the hour. You're on camera.
Okay, great.
Share your screen.
Boom, boom. There we go.
Perfect. Now from the top.
Mm.
I called her this morning.
Get an introduction for Charles.
Yeah,
Get set up.
what's up with that?
Charles, how do you say your last name?
Oh, I meant to go over that with you. That. I was gonna spell it out like in the email, Babendreier.
Babendreier.
That's,
Babendreier. Charles Babendreier is a master's student at UTIG working under the supervision of Dr. Shishwal. Charles currently studies seismic reflection data acquired along subduction zones to understand processes related to geohazardous events such as megathrust earthquakes, submarine landslides, and tsunamis. Take it away, Charles. That was a good.
And everybody online can hear me just fine. Okay, let me get these distracting.
I'll hide it.
Try to get the laser. and whatnot. Bear with me. The
You remember.
laser.
Oh, it's at the bottom.
There we go. Okay. All right, everybody. I appreciate everybody tuning in, and this, you'll have to bear with me. This is a very raw, dare I say, fresh project that I really started looking at the data a handful of weeks ago. And in talking about it publicly for the first time today, but was happy to do so. It's a good opportunity to flesh out the details of the path of the research and whatnot. But nonetheless, despite the short time frame that I've had to work on this, thanks, of course, to the guidance and infinite wisdom of Shosho Han, I think we've been able to come out with some pretty pretty great outcomes for our investigation of the Puerto Rico Trench. So there we go. These controls. Good. Floating. There we go. All right. So obviously this talk wouldn't be complete without me, pulling you in and convincing you why you should care about the Puerto Rico Trench, and furthermore, what we've done to care about it from a research perspective. So the Puerto Rico Trench exhibits several fascinating qualities. It's the deepest setting in the Atlantic Ocean, reaching depths in excess of 8,000 meters. It's the widest trench, period, around the globe. It defined below 6,000 meters depth, and it's also the home of the highest negative gravity anomaly in the world as well. But yeah, that's all cool. But yeah, it's great and all. But the Puerto Rico Trench, on a more serious note, is a subduction zone. And as we know, subduction zones are subduction zones are the host of some pretty devastating geologic hazards that have impacted several communities over the course of human civilization. And it wasn't really until the really powerful releases of energy of the 2011 Tohoku and 2004 Sumatra earthquakes that people really started thinking about the possibility for subduction zones worldwide to generate such powerful events. The Tohoku and Sumatra events occurred at plate boundaries where the subduction was highly oblique, and that's similar to what we have going on here at the Puerto Rico Trench. And I'll go over some of the tectonic details in a moment, but right. So as it pertains to subduction mechanisms in the Puerto Rico Trench wasn't always really regarded or respected as its status as a subduction zone. And that's basically because there's just such a predominance of strike slip motion here, as you can see from this plate boundary map. And in earlier investigations of this region, there weren't any compelling geomorphic expressions that you typically find at subduction zones, like a well-developed accretionary wedge, things like that. So it was kind of brushed off. But thankfully, over the recent, decade or two, the recognition of the Puerto Rico Trench as, a proper subduction zone that could potentially subject the nearby coastal communities of Puerto Rico and Hispaniola, the Virgin Islands. It's being recognized for its capacity to potentially generate events like Tohoku or Sumatra. But, with that being said, there's still a lot we don't know about the Puerto Rico Trench, specifically some of the deeper structures that, we're missing information that would allow us to better, more confidently assess these surrounding regions for potential geohazards like great megathrust earthquakes. So as you can see here in this figure by Yuri Tenbrink, we have these two cross sections showing some seismicity, one in the west and one in the east, and generally the seismicity here is pretty limited. So the Wadati Benioff zone, which is intended to really outline where subduction earthquakes happen, isn't very well established at the Puerto Rico Trench. Whereas in places like Alaska, where there's abundant seismicity at the plate interface, those slab geometries are much better understood. Anyways, with the limited nature of the subduction related seismicity at the Puerto Rico Trench, they were still able to discern that there were these along strike changes in the deepness, the steepness, and the general position of the slab, and even used lines of evidence such as seismicity, bathymetric observations, and so forth to suggest that there's a slab tear, a tear in the subducting North American plate at about 64 degrees west. And further work that made use of strain inversions, things like that, that I dare not get into, or supported this hypothesis of a potential slab tear at the Puerto Rico Trench. So I didn't realize that this is there a way to hide this bottom panel here? I guess it's not a big deal. Yeah, you guys get the point. So, yeah, before we start getting into the, thank you, Chris.
No.
It's okay. Before I get into the real meat of this presentation and this project, I'll briefly go over the important relevant geology and the general tectonic history of the Puerto Rico Trench. So in modern day, as we see here by this cross-section diagram, which actually makes use of the data that I've used, and you can already start to get an idea as to how old these data really are by the date. But anyways, we have this arc basement, which Puerto Rico is sitting on top of, and this arc basement material is overlain by these sediments that started depositing in the Cretaceous and experienced some tilting during the Pliocene and Holocene epochs. And as for the relative plate motion, that was indicated on, if I go back to this map here, you can see the relative plate motion of North America with respect to the Caribbean plate. That's indicated here by this arrow, and you can see how the subduction style here transitions from head-on subduction here along the Lesser Antilles, and then it experiences the subduction becomes highly oblique around the curvature as you traverse along the Caribbean plate boundary. So this figure I have here in the bottom right is these are seafloor ages by a compilation available in GeoMap app. I just got a quick screenshot so you had an idea as to how old the subducting oceanic lithosphere was, and it turns out, I'm highlighting really where these the seismic lines I'll go over in a bit cover, and the age range is anywhere between 100 to about 115 million years old. So 15 million year difference in plate age, but compared to the overall age of the plates, it's not a tremendous difference. And something you may also notice in the pattern of the plate ages is that you can see that they're offset at some intervals, and these are fracture zones that are the structural response of these plates and spreading occurring over a spherical surface. Yeah, and the trench is thought to be have initiated in the Oligocene, and then it really started taking off in the late Miocene to early Pliocene, and there's not a lot of frontal deformation going on, or it's very minimal so far at the deformation front that I'm kind of highlighting right now, and also here. And people have taken that to be to represent young frontal deformation. So now we get into an introduction of the data. So I've been spending the last few weeks looking at this legacy data set from the EW 9605 cruise that was collected on the RV Maurice Ewing in 1996. So you might be asking why I'm interested or even bothering with data that is older than me, but it turns out it's a really handy data set that you'll see some of the cool things important things we've been able to pull out from these data. Like I said, we don't know much about the deeper parts of the Puerto Rico Trench structurally and tectonically, just because we don't have those earthquakes. And even though we have this legacy data set, a lot of the publications, any published interpretations of these data primarily focused on details of the upper seismic sections, like you saw in the geologic overview, that they had plenty of interpretations of the carbonate sediments and the some of those structures, but not to say that they were lazy about it, but the deeper parts were a bit lacking, and we feel that there's plenty of potential just waiting to be tapped into of these untouched for a long time seismic profiles. So we decided to revisit them and focus on the deeper, this shallow plate interface structure at the Puerto Rico Trench, and this thicker black line that runs east to west is showing the trench axis. It's not terribly clear that this is the deepest part of the trench from this perspective, but I can assure you it is. You can see we have the Caribbean side, and then we have the North American side, the North American plate. And then if you kind of squint, and you can make out this flat-lying area between the north and south trench walls that's really just built up stratigraphy that's fed into the deeper parts of the trench. You can see these really impressive networks of channels that feed into the trench and fill in various valleys and so on. But so it's good that we're able to get some stuff out of this data, but the real reason and the definition, or what set the urgency for a speed run interpretation of these legacy profiles, is that Joshua and I will actually be departing for a research cruise, MGL 2315, and we fly out on Friday So, yeah, it's been busy, especially with this and everything else, but the intention of, this project is to serve as kind of a precursor study and, help inform interpretations that will be made on yet to be acquired seismic profiles. So if finally, I don't know how many minutes in we are, but our first look at one of the seismic images. So these are single channel seismic profiles, and I won't get into detail. So there's single channel and multi-channel, and let's just say multi-channel is generally better at capturing a more variety of rate paths and so on. And maybe a kilometer long streamer that's recording the air gun shots for this survey, whereas the upcoming survey will have a 15-kilometer long streamer, which is better. And I'll leave it at that. Anyways, from this seismic profile that I've picked, this is in my opinion, one of the more representative profiles. It samples a good bit of both the carbonate platform that I was mentioning earlier, some of the abyssal material, and then the north wall of the Puerto Rico Trench. And yeah, so that line's indicated by the red overlay on the map, and you can start picking apart the large scale anatomy of this part of the Puerto Rico Trench. So obviously I have some of the major features indicated here. We have the nice layers of the carbonate platform that plenty of people have studied. And if you look a little bit deeper, you can see that arc basement. And then we have this tremendous drop in relief. Also note that the vertical axes on this profile and the profiles to come are in two-way travel time. So it's not a perfect representation of what's in depth. And I have it vertically exaggerated by 10 times, which I thought was a lot, but then I saw Carson's like 300 times vertical exaggeration. So yeah, I feel all right. Yeah, so everything between really the shelf break and up to the deformation front here, it's basically the wedge, the accretionary wedge of the Puerto Rico Trench subduction zone, where material is slowly piled up and pushed landwards due to the convergence of these two plates. And you can see those flat lying trench basin filling stratigraphy I think I mentioned earlier, a little section that is bounded by the north and south walls of the trench. And then of course the emphasis on this study is in the characteristics and deformation pattern of the incoming North American plate. You can see it's quite fractured. It's quite fractured, at least in this perspective, and that's something you'll see on plenty of the lines when I pull up absolutely all of the interpretations on one slide somehow. And yeah, so that subducting oceanic crust that continues downward into the beneath the outer wedge here. And an important note is that the record length of these data are 13 seconds, which, as you'll see in some of the slides to come, that it's a limited record length, and it's almost a hindrance. It's certainly a hindrance to some deeper interpretations that we just have no way of getting because of the short record length. But anyways, now that we've broken down the anatomy and of the plate boundary perpendicular to the trench, across the trench and so on, we can have a look at all of the interpretations. And I think if I go back here, you can see that the numbering scheme for these profiles is pretty wacky. They were jumping around a lot, it seems. So we have 14, 13, and 12 in the easternmost part, and 30 and 29. That sounds normal. But then in the middle, we have 3 and 4 and 19. So it's a difficult order to follow, and I mean, I wasn't gonna rename them, but just keep that in mind when you look at, you know, some of these line labels. They don't necessarily reflect the position sequentially. But what I have here are panels. We have 19 trench crossing profiles, and so the interpretations that I made on all of those trench crossing profiles are depicted here in these panels. And it starts here at P30, that westernmost line, and it works down going east, and we jump back up going east again, and we finish off at P14, which is our easternmost line. And you can see that some of these image well into the outer ridge of the North American plate, and some of them don't. They just tickle the slopes, but that's weird. But you know, a resounding observation from these panels altogether is the obvious changes in the nature and geometry of the subducting plate as you go along strike. And on the basis of those changes, we decided to, as you can see from these horizontal arrows, colored horizontal arrows, you can see that we've decided to divide the trench into 4 segments, primarily based on the observations that we observed for the incoming plate. And its geometry, its deformation, its fracturing, etc. So intuitively, we have S1 starting on the right. Then we have S2 followed by S3 and S4. So 4 segments of the Puerto Rico Trench, each pretty much characterized by a unique set of incoming plate characteristics. So S1, for instance, that would be the easternmost segment. And if you see these eastern profiles here, I thought I had, maybe not. So you can see from the truncated legend that the incoming plate is in blue, and any fractures which are interpreted as faults, any offsets in the crust are in yellow. And those are actually the 2 most important interpretations of the study, and they're nowhere to be found. Anyways, you can see that these eastern profiles, P12 is kind of an exception to, but P12 was a noisy line, a lot of bad channels, it seemed. But you can see a distinct, like it's almost like a stair-step geometry for these eastern profiles, and that it really mimics the similar fabric you see in these crustal blocks in the east. And we have a pretty rather substantial gap between the next set of profiles. Some of these had bad navigation, just wouldn't import. Is it 3? I'm so sorry, Patty. I think that's a good stuff. The point is, yeah, it's important. Yeah, so we have this stair-step like geometry for these eastern profiles, and then this central group S2, which you can see this funky fabric of the incoming plate as the plate boundary curves and changes orientation slightly. It's almost a V shape, and it's propagating upwards. But you can see that these this next set of seismic profiles show these tilted elevated blocks, and S3, that's a pretty distinctive segment in that it's defined by these ridge basin like incoming plate geometries. So quite unique in comparison to everything else. So probably the most distinguishable incoming plate geometry out of anything else. And then we have the westernmost segment S4, And you could see that the plate interface geometry really starts to smooth out. And we'll talk about, I'll contextualize these along strike differences in a moment. But yeah, from all of these interpretations, as I'm sure many of you are aware, you can make some cool gridded surfaces out of these. I did this directly within the seismic interpretation software, and you can see those pics for the incoming plate. And these white lines, we have the top of the trench basin sediments that it's that same feature that I said was bounded by the north and south walls. And you know, it was tricky getting a geologically reasonable surface. You can see it's still not perfect, but after turning several knobs and messing with the gridding parameters and things like that, I think it's I think this was my favored gridded result because I think it captures some of the connectedness between local profiles, but it also demonstrates the like tectonic disconnectedness across the entire trench. In other words, as our segmentation of the trench suggests, adjacent parts of the incoming plate are similar, obviously. I don't think these images came out all too well. I don't think I had the amplitudes turned up high enough, but this is really to demonstrate how the plate interface looks along strike and just a representative profile for each segment. So in our easternmost segment, you can see it's a pretty bright interface, and the interpretation is not on here right now, but there's actually some higher amplitudes down here that are fairly continuous, and we think that the plate interface might step down dramatically here. So the next segment, it's not a very visible plate interface, neither for the third segment, and yeah, it's a terrible view here. Not very convincing, but the incoming plate just steepens out super fast. I'm tracking where it actually lies into a travel time, and you can see it's truncated prematurely because of that 13-second limit. And finally, on the westernmost, I don't think that's the westernmost line. What is it? We'll move on. So, since we have all of those interpretations to work with, both of the oceanic basement and the faults, I was able to export those interpretations and play some games with plotting. And what I have here plotted on this map are all of the offsets that we were able to measure from the Ewing profiles, and you can see how those data stack up when plotted against longitude. So we have longitude here on the x-axis, and the magnitude of the separation between discontinuities of the crust. So yeah, the bigger the offset, the more. And these squares that I have here, those indicate offsets measured landward of the deformation front, which you can see here. So it's a combination of the limited record length and our inability to see anything super deep or past the outer wedge with respect to the incoming plate. Most of the faulting appears to be, from the higher number of circles and squares, a lot of the faulting is observed seaward of the deformation front, where the incoming plate is entering the Puerto Rico Trench. And additionally, another big takeaway from these depictions are that these easternmost profiles are much more fractured apparently than the westernmost profiles. And so in a lot of at subduction zones, as the incoming plate enters the trench, it's subject to bending forces and yeah, that flexure, that lithospheric flexure associated with the bending generates faults. Generally normal faults that increase in intensity as it nears its subduction fate. And a paper by Renero et al. It's a kind of pioneer in describing why these fractures are oriented in the way that they are. And it just so happens that in his study, which this here is a map of the mid-America Trench, and you can see these lineations that parallel the trench. And these are normal bend faults from subduction bending forces, and they align with fabrics that are related to its formation at the spreading center in the Pacific. So as the crust is formed, these fractures and pre-existing zones of weakness are inherently created and inherited in the crust, which later reactivate. But in the case of Puerto Rico, obviously we have the Mid-Atlantic Ridge with respect to the Puerto Rico figure. It's way out here, but the point is the fabric inherited at the ridge is oriented in a completely different direction than the orientation of the trench. Also, the fracture zones that I noted earlier that are basically perpendicularly oriented to the seafloor spreading fabric, those are also misaligned. They're not aligned well with the fabric that we see of this, particularly this eastern part of the incoming plate. And yeah, those changes. Yeah. Anyways, I was actually just about to say that the changes in the deformation of the incoming plate can we choose to simply attribute it to the curvature of the plate boundary and the increasing component of strike slip motion towards the west, so that subduction bending fabric isn't nearly as pervasive as it is in the east, where that subduction still has a higher component of convergence. A big research objective of the upcoming cruise is to determine the hydration state of the North American plate, how wet it is essentially as it subducts beneath the Caribbean, because plate hydration is an important factor controlling subduction processes, the seismogenic rupture width, so on. And we ultimately hypothesize that this pervasive fractured fabric created in the eastern part of the Puerto Rico Trench, in combination with these fractures and associated hydration related to its formation at the ridge, and we have the fracture zone oriented northwest southeast that also cuts through. So I hypothesize that this part of the Puerto Rico Trench and the subducting lithosphere is immensely hydrated. It's almost like a diced onion. It's just being cut every which way it seems. So that's our and I think I can cut it off there. So yeah.
How does the cruise going, like, to resurvey the exact same place, the previous one?
Yeah, so I don't have them plotted here. I don't know how confidential the information is, but for the MCS component, there's going to be an OBS component as well. But for the MCS, it's going to be a series of, I think, along 2 strike lines and a couple of dip lines as well. And they're pretty much centered about this pre-existing data set. So it won't be nearly as densely imaged, but it'll be much deeper and of a modern quality. So once we understand the deeper characteristics of the plate boundary from that data, those data, we'll be able to maybe extend those connections or extend those findings to what we have of these older data and integrate it to make a
And then you'll have where line number or, you know.
no, that was a mess. That was, yeah, if I had to do it again, I would have renumbered them. Like 1, 19, that's it. But
It probably that's like because of weather or something.
yeah, no, definitely, I think, yeah, listen to me talking about,
I know, right? Well, good, thanks.
you got it.